Can Christians be rich? Let's look at what the Bible says. Number 1, Joanna, the wife of Herod's household manager, and other women supported Jesus and the disciples. This is from Luke chapter 8. Number 2, Joseph of Arimathea was clearly a rich disciple. You can read about him in Matthew 27 as well as the other Gospels. He gave his tomb to Jesus to be buried in. Number 3, Nicodemus. We hear about him in several different passages, but especially in John 19, it says that he brought 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes to prepare Jesus' body for burial. That stuff's expensive. Number 4, Cornelius. He gave alms generously and prayed continually. This is the guy that Peter went to talk to as sort of one of the first Gentiles who became a Christian. That story is in Acts chapter 10. Number 5, there's a lady named Lydia who sold purple goods and hosted Paul's group during his travels in Acts chapter 16. Purple goods were not cheap back then. That dye was not easy to obtain. It was very expensive. In order to be a merchant of purple goods, you had to have quite a bit of money for your inventory. Number 6, Aquila and Priscilla, craftsmen who hosted Paul. Now, you could argue, are they rich? Maybe, maybe not. Kind of on the edge, probably. But they had the resources to host Paul, and they were craftspeople. So back then they would have had still quite a bit more money than most of the people around them, which I think is a fair definition for the word rich. So you can read about those two in Acts chapter 18. All right, number 7, Erastus. He was the city treasurer of Corinth, which was a very wealthy, influential city. Somebody doesn't arise to that position unless they themselves are pretty wealthy. I mean, I would bet money on that. I don't know for sure, but I would put money on it. Romans chapter 16, you can read about him. Then we have a pretty famous guy, Luke, the physician. He was a medical doctor. He's mentioned in Colossians chapter 4. He also wrote the book of Luke and Acts. Another person who had way more resources and wealth than the average person in those days. Number 9, there's a guy mentioned very briefly in Titus chapter 3, Zenas. He was a lawyer. Okay, number 10, Philemon had servants. He hosted a local church and had enough space to have a whole separate guest room for Paul. Paul also asked Philemon in the book Philemon to free his servant Onesimus, who had run away from him. So probably the loss of this servant was not a huge deal to Philemon. It sounds like he had plenty of other resources. Paul probably wasn't putting him out too much by asking him to free this one servant. Now, it's worth pausing for a second to notice that these rich people were known for sharing what they had. They hosted the church in their house. They hosted traveling missionaries. They gave out of their own resources to support Jesus and the disciples. So they weren't clinging and holding tight their wealth. They were generous. They were sharing it. In addition to these people mentioned by name, we also know that several epistles had direct teaching to people who were rich. So in Colossians chapter 3, Paul instructed wealthy Christians with servants. In 1 Timothy 6, Paul gave even more instructions for the rich, basically to be generous and that kind of thing. So if he's speaking to rich Christians in the church, then there were rich Christians. If we even go a step further, there are lots of hints that Paul himself was probably rich, at least sometimes. He was extremely well educated. He paid the expenses for 5 vows. You can read about that in Acts 21. He possessed a very valuable Roman citizenship, which you can read about in Acts 22. Now, he did not pay for his citizenship. He was born a citizen. but he was probably born to an influential family. The education point kind of goes along with that too. Okay, number 4, when Paul was being held by Felix and questioned by Felix, Acts 24 says that Felix hoped Paul would bribe him. Now, why would Felix hope that? Felix was a powerful, rich person with a lot of control in their society, and he was hoping that Paul would bribe him. That says to me that Paul probably had pretty considerable financial resources at that time. We also know from Acts chapter 28 that Paul lived in Rome for 2 whole years at his own expense. He owned a bunch of books and parchments. He mentions that in 2 Timothy chapter 4. That stuff was not cheap back then. On the other hand, Paul did accept gifts occasionally and wrote about being hungry and in want in Philippians. So although there's hints that he was pretty well-to-do, at least at times, we also know for a fact that he went through times of deprivation where he didn't have even enough food to satisfy him. So whatever wealth he had, Paul did not let it hold him back from, going on all these missionary journeys, going through difficult, dangerous situations for the sake of the people he wanted to share the gospel with. He didn't let that hold him back. So in light of all these examples, I want to ask you, why do some people think having money is morally wrong? Please let me know in the comments section down below. However, Paul writes elsewhere that the desire for riches, not riches themselves necessarily, but the desire for riches can cause all kinds of problems. So watch this video, it'll be linked to up here to find out more about that. Thank you for watching. Please hit the like button if you got value, and we'll see you in the next one.